I think that one of the big problems that people have in terms of understanding the primeval aspects of other people is that they assume certain pre-existing qualities. For example, sensitivity, for example, a charged nature with regard to the other person's tendencies. For instance, being charged towards the positive or negative aspects of certain situations, like a charged atom, having a pre-existent negative or positive charge, rather than just being neutral, and presuming a certain kind of emotionality or infantile status in relation to the primeval aspects of another person. And of course, let us not forget that traditionally femininity has been associated with these early primeval states, or what the Freudians call the pre-Oedipal states. And therefore associated with all these aspects that we, from a more civilized and more conditioned perspective, associate with infantilism. So, like I said, we make culturally conditioned assumptions about what the state entails. We assume that it implies sensitivity. We assume that it implies subjectivity as a pejorative, meaning negative opposite to objectivity. Objectivity being in tune with objective reality. We make all sorts of assumptions. Indeed, the assumption about what is objective reality might be the most assumptive. What we assume to be objectivity is, in fact, in some senses, the opposite. In some senses, it's the high susceptibility to socially conditioned states. It's not objectivity at all. And yet we confuse it precisely with what is objectivity, and we confuse primeval states with precisely what is subjectivity, whereas in a way they are exactly in the opposite relationship. Whereas the unconditioned state, the socially unconditioned state, is far more attuned to openness and neutrality, whereas the socially conditioned state is far more charged with tendencies to reflexively embrace or oppose certain attitudes or everybody has once they are born a certain level of conditioning into the world, and it is possible, I am sure, that they could become positively or negatively charged towards certain circumstances. Perhaps that's the basis of object relation psychology, to understand the way that we become charged, as it were, towards certain objects that we see as positive and some that we see as very negative. But in my case, my sense of being was related, I now come to see, to my father's very aggressive, sometimes hostile rages that enabled me to develop a state of mind that was roughly, although not at all negatively in the sense of contributing to my state of being, but roughly dissociative. He used to fall into a complete rage. I remember one time in Mozambique when I was playing on the roundabout swings, and there was some argument with my mother, and she said, don't hit Jenny, you're going to hurt Jenny. And it was a terrifying situation. I was still young enough to be carried around. I wasn't I was able to sit on a chair, as I recall, and swing on the roundabout, but I wasn't fully mobile, and I was terrified out of my mind that he would harm me, maybe kill me, and I believe those kinds of experiences led to my capacity to sort of dissociate, sort of make myself separate from the situation, not in a complete sense, but in a somewhat sense. And that has been that almost militant, almost combative, dissociative tendency has been a part of me ever since. I would say that that aspect is very, very neutral. It's the basis for my ability to philosophize, to set myself aside from any situation and say, well, this is what I see about it. It's not to do directly with me, but to do with other people in that situation. And then, after that point, additionally, how I can manage that situation, and finally, how I choose to manage that situation. So it's not to do with a reflex reaction. I don't have those. I've never had those. Always when I'm in trouble, I tend to move into this psychologically doubled state where my mind dissociates from the situation, and then I analyze it in a completely neutral way, in a way that doesn't have to do with my desire to react, or even my capacity to react. I set myself aside from it, and then I come back into that situation, and I handle it. Sometimes well, and sometimes, who knows, maybe not as well as other people might. But that capacity to double oneself, that capacity to set oneself aside, that neutrality of consciousness is my basic pre-Oedipal or primeval state. And I think it's very, very assumptive for people to assume, of course, that it should be, or that it necessarily ought to be something charged up in some distortive manner. I think this is a psychoanalytical pessimism in favor of society and in favor of the notion that social conditioning is the ultimate good thing and the ultimate, perhaps, redemption for all of us. My view is that that isn't at all the case, that the situation with regard to our conditioning and our primeval states that are not susceptible to conditioning is much, much more complicated than that. What I have against psychoanalysis is the assumption that the pre-socialized mind is not in any fit condition to make any real judgments about the world. That is already a perspective from a very socially conditioned, socially biased mind. A biased mind that already divides the world into masculine and feminine, already divides the being against itself. But the preconditioned mind can in fact be much more open, much more neutral, much more receptive. And this is something that psychoanalysis does not even, from my readings, does not generally, except in the case of Wilfred Bion and certain English psychoanalysts, does not take into account, does not take into consideration. I think Bion does, because he views the world in a slightly different light, and he perceives that the best way to actually ascertain somebody's mental state is to have a complete state of openness oneself. And in that sense, he does understand that there is a certain, one might say, maybe in his terms not primeval, but very open and very receptive state that does that does form a gateway, form a receptive basis for receiving somebody else's primeval meanings and messages. So in a sense, he tacitly acknowledges, in a sense, but not directly, that the primeval is the most open level, is the most broad-minded, is the most neutral level.